night, I was out in the streets and I saw millions of homeless people. You should be out there, Theresa May. You should be building houses. Look, I'm only 5 years old. There's nothing I can do about it. You've got the pot of money. Spend some and help people. That's what you've got to do. I'm very angry.
Made my bed for the night in a doorway off the street. But the late night city drinkers, they won't let me go asleep. All I want is a pillow that isn't made of stone. Give me shelter from the storm. I want a small patch of earth with a personal address. A fire would be good, but I'd be happy having less. Just a stove in the kitchen that I can call my own. Give me shelter from the storm. Give me shelter, give me somewhere safe and warm. Just a door with a number that I can call a home. Give me shelter, give me shelter, give me shelter from the storm. There's a property ladder, but they're all cut through. A mountain's worth of red tape that's blocking out the view. Faceless bureaucracy wherever I may roam. Give me shelter from the storm. The right to buy became a right to let. A savings plan became a mounting debt. Who needs a house when you've got a retail zone? Give me shelter from the storm. Give me shelter, give me somewhere safe and warm. Just a door with a number that I can call a home. Give me shelter, give me shelter, give me shelter from the storm. Old Gerard Winstanley, he famously declared,
the earth's a common treasury for everyone to share.
But someone pawned the treasure for a payday loan. Give me shelter from the storm. From my doorway on the street, as I look across the town, I can see the high street banks that are standing all around. Their money's keeping warm while I'm freezing to my bones. Give me shelter from the storm. Give me shelter from the storm.
And that was Commoners Choir with Shelter Song. Greetings and welcome to Bernie 2020. This is an independent podcast on progressive politics, inspired by Bernie Sanders, progressive and radical activism, and the Green Party. This isn't a candidate. This podcast is completely independent from any candidate, party, PAC, or political organization. If you want to reach out to me, you can send me a message at BernieUS2020@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at BernieUS2020. You can find out more about Bernie 2020 at Bernie-2020.com. You can find all the back episodes. You can even find all the episodes of Bernie 2016. You can also find some links to make a donation. You can make a one-time or recurring donation to keep this podcast free and independent. So another special episode, Bernie released his Housing for All plan. So we're going to read through it and see what it contains. You can find this at berniesanders.com. Under Issues, Housing for All. In the richest country in the history of the world, every American must have a safe, decent, accessible, and affordable home as a fundamental right. For more than 40 years, we have had an affordable housing crisis in America that has only gotten worse. In America today, over 18 million families are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. While last year alone, the 5 largest banks on Wall Street made a record-breaking $111 billion in profits. How are families in America supposed to pay for food, transportation, health care, prescription drugs, education, and child care when over half of their income is going to pay the rent or the mortgage? The sad and painful reality is that many of them cannot, and millions of Americans are going deeply into debt just to make ends meet. In America today, there is virtually no city or town where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a decent 2-bedroom apartment. Meanwhile, the top 25 hedge fund managers in America made an average of $850 million apiece last year. In America today, over 500,000 people will be sleeping out on the streets or in homeless shelters because they don't have the money to put a roof over their heads. Meanwhile, large, profitable corporations like Amazon, which is owned by the wealthiest person in the world, pay nothing in federal income taxes. In America today, corrupt real estate developers are gentrifying neighborhoods and forcing working families out of the homes and apartments where they have lived their entire lives and replacing them with fancy condominiums and hotels that only the very rich can afford. Sadly, we have a president right now who is not only ignoring the affordable housing crisis, he and his administration are actively making it worse. Instead of expanding federal housing programs, Trump wants to cut them by $9.6 billion, or 18%. Instead of working to substantially reduce the outrageously high price of housing, Trump has proposed tripling what some of the poorest senior citizens and people with disabilities in America are paying for rent today. Instead of expanding affordable housing, Trump is proposing to eliminate the National Housing Trust Fund, which invests in affordable housing and was based on legislation Bernie spearheaded in Congress. And outrageously, Trump has signed tax legislation that further enriches wealthy real estate investors and encourages gentrification. That is unacceptable and has got to change. In the richest country in the history of the world, every American must have a safe, decent, accessible, and affordable home as a fundamental right. We need a homes guarantee. Build the millions of affordable housing units we need. In America today, there is a shortage of 7.4 million affordable homes for the lowest income renters. This severe housing shortage is negatively impacting rural and urban communities throughout America. Nearly half of the renters facing the greatest housing shortage are seniors or persons with disabilities. While rents are skyrocketing in large housing markets like New York or San Francisco, there has also been a spike in the number of Americans in rural areas who spend over half of their limited incomes on housing. Incredibly, while wages have stagnated throughout the country, average housing prices have gone up by 188% over the past 3 decades, while the median rent has increased by more than 60% since 1960. That has got to change. In 2001, Bernie first introduced legislation to create the National Affordable Housing Trust Fund, based largely on the success of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Trust Fund. After a 15-year effort in 2016, a modest version of Bernie's legislation became the first new federal affordable housing program funded in several decades. Administered by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, it is funded through a small percentage of revenues from government-sponsored housing agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Over the past 4 years, this program has invested $905 million on the construction, rehabilitation, and preservation of affordable housing throughout the country. But unfortunately, that is not nearly enough compared to the demand. If we are serious about addressing the affordable housing crisis, we need to build millions of apartments and homes throughout the country that will remain affordable in perpetuity to prevent displacement and serve future generations. And when we do that, we will create millions of good-paying jobs in the process. When Bernie is president, he will invest $1.48 trillion over 10 years in the National Affordable Housing Trust Fund to build, rehabilitate, and preserve the 7.4 million quality, affordable, and accessible housing units necessary to eliminate the affordable housing gap, which will remain affordable in perpetuity. Units constructed with this funding will be eligible to be located in mixed income developments. Use federal preemption laws to ensure these new units are not segregated or excluded by local zoning ordinances. Invest an additional $400 billion to build 2 million mixed-income social housing units to be administered through the National Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which will help desegregate and integrate communities. This plan will guarantee equity in social housing units, ensuring no inequality of services or conditions within units. And that's a really important point, because right now there's a lot of programs, local programs, state programs, and probably some federal programs that award money to developers to include affordable, quote unquote, affordable units in their developments. And in many of these developments, they are including those units in order to get those funds, but they're segregating those units. Even in high-rise apartments, you'll find buildings that have separate entrances for owners of those supported units, those quote-unquote low-income units, from the owners of the regular standard units in those buildings, and separate amenities as well. You don't want the people that are in those affordable units intermingling with the rest. When Bernie is president, he will expand USDA's Section 515 program by $500 million to build new affordable developments in rural areas and protect existing units from being converted to market rate housing. Increase funding for the Indian Housing Block Grant Program to $3 billion to build, preserve, and rehabilitate affordable housing in Indian country. Revitalize our public housing stock. For decades, our nation has failed to provide adequate funding for public housing, causing our public housing stock to fall into a state of complete disrepair. Most public housing is in desperate need of reconstruction and rehabilitation. As a direct result of this chronic underinvestment, residents lose heat in the winter, need kitchen repairs to cook their meals, and do not have adequate accommodations for residents with disabilities. Public housing residents should not be forced to live in unhealthy and unsafe conditions because of a massive underinvestment in these facilities. In America today, an estimated 1.6 million families are on a waiting list for public housing because of a lack of federal funding. And it can take several years before many of these families are able to receive the assistance that they need. In addition, more than 10,000 public housing units are lost each year due to demolition and disposition, often because they are in poor condition. This can eliminate the only affordable housing option for communities throughout America. That is unacceptable. It is past time to preserve, rehabilitate, and expand our nation's public housing stock. When Bernie is president, he will invest $70 billion to repair and modernize public housing, including making all public housing accessible, and provide access to high-speed broadband for all public housing residents. Repeal the Faircloth Amendment to allow the construction of new public housing units. Ensure that public housing has high-quality shared community spaces. Through the Green New Deal, electrify and decarbonize all public housing by conducting deep energy retrofits, including appliances, power, and heating. Make rent affordable. Today, 7.7 million families in America are forced to pay more than half of their limited incomes on rent because they are eligible for Section 8 rental assistance, but do not receive it because of a lack of federal resources. As a result, many of these families are forced to choose between paying rent or buying the food, medicine, or prescription drugs they need. That is unacceptable. We need to fully fund the Section 8 rental assistance program to make sure that every person in America who is eligible for this program is able to get it without being put on a waiting list. This will significantly reduce poverty, help families at risk of becoming homeless, and reduce evictions. And importantly, this assistance will help families afford rent right away while new affordable homes are being constructed. When Bernie is president, he will fully fund tenant-based Section 8 rental assistance at $410 billion over the next 10 years and make it a mandatory funding program for all eligible households. Strengthen the Fair Housing Act and implement a Section 8 non-discrimination law so that landlords can no longer discriminate against low-income families based on their source of income. Expand and strengthen enforcement of the small area fair market rent rule to make sure that landlords are fairly compensated when they participate in Section 8, but do not make a windfall from the program. Protect tenants. In America today, more than 2/3 of states preempt or limit the ability of their communities to establish rent control or stabilization rules to protect the American people against excessive increases in rent. That has got to change. We need to establish a national rent control standard and allow cities and states to go even further to protect tenants from the skyrocketing price of housing. Further, we must recognize that we are in the midst of an eviction crisis. At least 2 million renters throughout the country are at risk of losing their homes each year. Evictions, often over as little as $100, cause tremendous stress on families and can lead to worse health outcomes, job losses, and an unacceptable disruption in a child's education. We need to protect tenants from unjust evictions and provide support to ensure we keep families in their homes. Zip codes in New York City, where a right to counsel was created in 2017, saw their eviction rates drop 5 times faster than comparable areas. Expanding these programs to other states and cities will reduce evictions and give tenants fair representation in court. When Bernie is president, he will enact a national cap on annual rent increases at no more than 3% or 1.5 times the consumer price index, whichever is higher, to help prevent the exploitation of tenants at the hands of private landlords. Allow for landlords to apply for waivers if significant capital improvements are made, which will incentivize landlords to improve the conditions of their properties. Allow states and cities to pass even stronger rent control standards. Implement a just cause requirement for evictions, which would allow a landlord to evict a tenant only for specific violations and prevent landlords from evicting tenants for arbitrary or retaliatory reasons. Provide $2 billion in federal matching grants for states and localities to provide a right to counsel for persons in eviction or foreclosure proceedings or at risk of losing their Section 8 rental assistance. Combat gentrification, exclusionary zoning, segregation, and speculation. While we expand and build new housing, we must ensure that current tenants and homeowners are not forced out of their homes or neighborhoods. We must also ensure that wealthy and exclusionary neighborhoods do not prevent new development, forcing gentrification and displacement in low-income and minority areas. In addition, developers and speculators must not reap profits from these neighborhoods without reinvesting in the existing community. Currently, 9 states do not allow for inclusionary zoning rules that require developers to set aside affordable housing on their projects. That has got to change. We also need to promote integration and end local segregation that excludes low-income and minority tenants and homeowners. Restrictive zoning ordinances are a racist legacy of Jim Crow-era efforts to enforce segregation. We need to make federal housing and transportation funds contingent on remedying these zoning ordinances and coordinate with state and local officials and leaders to ensure equitable zoning. Federal funds must no longer be used to segregate and disrupt our communities. The interstate highway expansion often cut through low-income and minority communities, segregated urban areas, and contributed to sprawl. We must reorient federal policy to create livable, connected communities for all. When Bernie is president, he will create an office within the Department of Housing and Urban Development to coordinate and work with states and municipalities to strengthen rent control and tenant protections. Implement fair and inclusive zoning ordinances. Streamline review processes and direct funding where these changes are made. This office will convene key leaders, academics, experts, local officials, renters, tenants, and homeowners to create and implement these necessary solutions. Preempt laws that prevent inclusionary zoning for luxury developments. End exclusionary and restrictive zoning ordinances and replace them with zoning that encourages racial, economic, and disability integration that makes housing more affordable. Require that recipients of federal funding from the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development make these important zoning reforms. Provide funding to states that preempt local exclusionary zoning ordinances to make housing more equitable, accessible, and affordable for all. Make federal funding contingent on creating livable communities. Encourage zoning and development that promotes integration and access to public transportation to reduce commuting time, congestion, and long car commutes. Prioritize projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, create walkable and livable communities, and reduce urban sprawl. Encourage zoning and development designed to expand and maximize the number of units fully accessible to people with disabilities. Place a 25% house flipping tax on speculators who sell a non-owner occupied property if sold for more than it was purchased within 5 years of purchase. Impose a 2% empty homes tax on the property value of vacant owned homes to bring more units into the market and curb the use of housing as speculative investment. Encourage, quote, circuit breakers on property taxes to protect homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods from being priced out of their own homes as their property values rise. End homelessness in America. It is unacceptable that in America tonight, more than 500,000 Americans will be sleeping out on the streets or in homeless shelters because they don't have the money to put a roof over their heads, while the 3 richest families in America experienced a $101 billion increase in their wealth last year. This is a national embarrassment. In the richest country on earth, we will invest nearly $32 billion over the next 5 years to end homelessness in America. When Bernie is president, he will prioritize 25,000 National Affordable Housing Trust Fund units in the first year to house the homeless. double McKinney-Vento homelessness assistance grants to more than $26 billion over the next 5 years to build permanent supportive housing. Provide $500 million in funding to states and localities to provide outreach to the homeless, to help connect them to case management and social services to ensure nobody is left behind. Fair housing for all. It is unacceptable that more than 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, people still face housing discrimination on the basis of race, sex, gender, religion, country of origin, or disability. That has got to end. We must strengthen and expand the Fair Housing Act and increase enforcement to eliminate housing discrimination, which is still pervasive throughout the United States. As President Bernie will, create an independent national fair housing agency similar to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau dedicated to protecting renters from housing discrimination, investigating landlords who misuse Section 8 vouchers, and enforcing housing standards for renters. The Fair Housing Agency will also conduct audits to hold landlords and sellers engaged in housing discrimination accountable. Create an office within the Fair Housing Agency to protect mobile home residents from housing discrimination, rent instability, and unjust evictions. Fully fund the Fair Housing Assistance and Fair Housing Initiatives programs at $1 billion over the next 10 years. Pass the Equality Act to include LGBTQ+ Americans in the Fair Housing Act. Implement the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule blocked by President Trump's administration to ensure that federal funds will promote fair housing. Enforce the Olmstead decision, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure access to accessible integrated housing. Ensure that all new Section 811 supportive housing is fully integrated. Make sure that people who have served their time are not excluded from public housing. Ensure that no survivor of domestic violence can be evicted on the basis of their assault. Guarantee that renters have the right to form tenants' unions free from retaliation by landlords or managing agents. Expand sustainable home ownership. When Bernie was mayor of Burlington, Vermont, he took the lead in establishing the first municipally funded community land trust to provide affordable home ownership opportunities to working families. Now called the Champlain Housing Trust, it now manages over 600 shared equity homes and has helped over 1,000 families become first-time home buyers. In a community land trust, families purchase homes at affordable prices and agree to sell them back to the trust at a restricted price. This keeps homes affordable in perpetuity and builds wealth for families who currently are priced out of home ownership. As President Bernie will provide grants to states, cities, and towns to establish their own community land trusts that will enable over 1 million households to purchase a shared equity home over the next 25 years. Further, when those families begin building wealth and move on to conventional home ownership, the homes will remain affordable for future owners. This program will also combat gentrification. For example, the Douglas Community Land Trust in Washington, D.C., which operates in gentrified areas, has successfully helped many families stay in the neighborhoods they grew up in or have lived in for decades. Moreover, this program will promote resident-owned manufactured housing communities to give residents more control over their housing costs and to prevent evictions. As President Bernie will, invest $50 billion over 10 years to provide grants to start and expand community land trusts and other shared equity home ownership models. This funding will enable over 1 million households to purchase affordable homes over the next 25 years. Invest an additional $15 billion to enact the 21st Century Homestead Act based on the work of Mirza Baradaran, Mirza Baradaran. It's MEHRSA to purchase and revitalize abandoned properties to create community and individual wealth and assets for historically disadvantaged communities. Instruct HUD to assist communities establishing shared equity homeownership by ensuring they can access existing federal housing programs and help new organizations build the necessary capacity to succeed. Support first-time home buyers. As a result of stagnant wages and the outrageously high price of housing, the American dream of home ownership is simply out of reach for tens of millions of families throughout the country. The rate of home ownership in America is lower today than it was in 1980 and still has not recovered from the 2008 housing crisis. That has got to change. We need to substantially expand federal programs to make sure that Americans throughout the country have the ability to buy their first home. We also need to make housing counseling available to all prospective home buyers. Study after study shows that people who receive counseling before buying a home are far more likely to succeed at home ownership. As President Bernie will invest an additional $2 billion at USDA and an additional $6 billion at HUD to create a first-time home buyer assistance program that will increase home ownership. Expand pre-purchase housing counseling to all prospective home buyers. End predatory lending and modern-day redlining. When Bernie was on the House Financial Services Committee, he fought to end predatory lending in the subprime housing market. Congress refused to act, and predatory subprime lending became rampant. Millions of Americans lost their homes, jobs, and life savings, while Wall Street received the largest taxpayer bailout in the history of the world with no strings attached. Black Americans alone lost 40% of their wealth in the 2009 housing crisis and were directly targeted by predatory lenders. While the government bailed out the crooks on Wall Street, ordinary Americans who were victims of predatory lending and mortgage fraud were left behind. That needs to change. Americans who lost their homes as a result of mortgage fraud and predatory lending must be provided the down payment assistance they need to buy a new home or receive financial aid to pay their current mortgage or rent. Further, many of the homes that Americans lost to foreclosure during the Great Recession were sold right back to the same Wall Street firms that caused the crisis. Since the financial crisis, firms on Wall Street have purchased thousands of homes, turned them into rentals, and securitized them to make outrageous profits. That has got to change, as President Bernie will end the mass sale of mortgages to Wall Street vulture funds and thoroughly investigate and regulate the practices of large rental housing investors and owners. Make data such as evictions, rent increases, and safety violations for large landlords available to the public and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Increase enforcement to protect families against fraudulent, deceptive, and abusive lending practices, and ensure all mortgage costs are clear, risks are visible, and nothing is buried in fine print. Implement legislation to prevent abusive, quote, contract for deed transactions, and use existing authority to protect communities of color, which for too long have been exploited by this practice. Protect consumers currently participating in, quote, contract for deed agreements by ensuring aggressive protections and decent standards for the consumers. Create a commission to establish a financial relief program to the victims of predatory lending, mortgage fraud, redlining, and those who are still underwater on their mortgages as a result of the 2008 Wall Street crash. This program shall include down payment assistance, mortgage relief, or rental assistance. This program must include protections to ensure that the financial relief it provides goes to the people who need it and not the Wall Street speculators who caused the crisis. Decarbonize our housing. We will pass a Green New Deal to achieve 100% sustainable energy for electricity and a fully decarbonized building sector by no later than 2030. As President Bernie will weatherize homes, perform energy efficiency upgrades to make buildings more energy efficient and lower energy bills, provide grants for low and moderate income families and small businesses to invest in weatherizing and retrofitting their homes and businesses. Because our mobile home stock is leaky and often very old, we plan to replace all mobile homes with quality zero-energy modular homes. Electrify homes. Provide grants for low and moderate income families to invest in cheaper electricity for these needs. A federal mandate through the Department of Energy will ensure that all new construction and wealthy homeowners meet our electrification goals. Energy assistance. We will expand the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, LIHEAP, to help low-income families pay their heating and cooling bills. Additionally, the program will be expanded to provide 10% of program costs for maintenance of new efficient heating and cooling systems and technical assistance for the installation and use of new furnaces, heat pumps, boilers, and other upgrades for the duration of the 10-year transition. Decarbonize public housing. Through the Green New Deal, we will electrify and decarbonize all public housing by conducting deep energy retrofits, including appliances, power, and heating. We will also ensure that public housing has quality shared community spaces to ensure every public housing complex has the capacity to serve as a community resiliency center. Save families money on energy bills. After 2035, electricity will be virtually free, aside from operations and maintenance costs. So that is the plan. Let's go and see what this name I tripped over is all about and see if I want to add this in. Executive summary is super short. Introduction. What did Bernie exactly say about this? Invest an additional $15 billion to enact the 21st Century Homestead Act based on the work of Mehrsa Baradaran. Mehrsa Baradaran. All right, based on this. How much of this do I want to read? So do I want to do overview of proposal? Sure. All right, here's this. Here's this. did I just say? Aside from operations and maintenance costs. So that is the entire text of Bernie's housing plan that's published on his website, berniesanders.com/issues. But if you remember, I really tripped badly over a name that referenced the 21st Century Homestead Act. That name was Mehrsa Baradaran. I think that's a lot better than my first attempt. And part of Bernie's plan says invest an additional $15 billion to enact the 21st Century Homestead Act based on the work of Mehrsa Baradaran. So I thought we'd take a quick look at what that work is. At greatdemocracyinitiative.org, you can find a copy of this act, Homestead Act. It's a Homestead Act for the 21st century. So this is the proposal that's included in this document that is linked from the Bernie Sanders plan. So here's a little bit about it. Here's an overview of the proposal. The 21st Century Homestead Program uses property grants to build wealth in communities that have been excluded from past and present public investment. It would also be a means of counteracting the great divergence in American cities, the lack of affordable quality housing, and the problem of hyper-vacancy. In order to spur revitalization, an initial investment of government capital will be used to buy, transfer, and restore a large cluster of abandoned properties in a city. Like the New Deal era credit programs, such as the government-sponsored Enterprise (GSE) mortgage programs, the Federal Housing Act (FHA), or the Export-Import Bank of the U.S., the public investment will be a revolving credit fund that will become self-sustaining on the secondary markets after an initial public investment. The aim of this program is to jumpstart a housing revival by financing the improvement of public infrastructure and creating the conditions for continued market investments and growth. The program will be federally funded and administered locally by a designated homestead office for the purpose of community revitalization. A special purpose public trust will purchase a critical mass of abandoned properties in a targeted city. The homes will be given through an absolute grant to qualified residents. The homes will be given through an absolute grant to qualified residents with a condition enforced through a forgivable lien to hold and improve the property for 10 years. A homestead grant for property improvements will accompany the property grant. In the spirit of the original Homestead Acts and the New Deal mortgage programs, this program will require a large initial grant and investment from the federal government that will yield returns for the federal government, communities, and individuals. Cities will compete for these grants based on the feasibility of their revitalization plan, which will include investments for employment, infrastructure, and public resources. And that is just a brief excerpt of this plan. This plan, once again, it's called A Homestead Act for the 21st Century. It's a report by Mehrsa Baradaran, and you can find it on greatdemocracyinitiative.org. And that'll wrap up this episode of Bernie 2020. Remember, if you want to reach out to me, you can send me a message at bernieus2020@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at bernieus2020. You can find out more about Bernie 2020 and check out all the back episodes at bernie-2020.com. You can also watch and listen to me record this podcast live at twitch.tv/unrelatedthings. And a brief note, I got a little crazy and decided to launch 3 new podcasts. They will certainly be irregular to begin with. Heck, this podcast itself, after 2+ years, is still irregular. But one is called People Are Revolting. It will focus on individuals and organizations that are fighting the good fight, that are trying to do what they can to improve our social, economic, and political situations locally and across the country and across the globe. The next is called Frack You Very Much, and that will be on fracking and its challenges and harms. And it has the subhead or tagline of A Fracking Terrible Podcast. And the third is Names and Addresses, and that is spurned from a quote by Utah Phillips. Utah Phillips said, "The earth isn't dying, it's being murdered." Actually, I think he said it's being killed. The earth isn't dying, it's being killed. And the people that are doing the killing have names and addresses. So the Names and Addresses podcast will unmask the malfeasance of the robber barons, the modern day quote-unquote captains of industry that really are only robber barons. We used to name things now and then as to what they were before doublespeak and before PR took over and tried to manipulate how we think. So when you hear about captains of industry, when you hear about entrepreneurs, and I'm not talking about the small business owners, I'm talking about the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos of the world. These aren't super entrepreneurs. These are robber barons, plain and simple. They are making a killing, sometimes, unfortunately, quite literally, off of their employees' hard work. So that is what Names and Addresses are all about. All 3 of those new podcasts do have a premiere episode up. You can find those on the Apple Podcasts, in the Apple Podcasts app, or any other app where you can retrieve such content. So that'll wrap up this episode of Bernie 2020. Here is the song Human Rights by The Truth. That is THATRUTH. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening.
Livable wages initiated, so every person has the basics. Every worker compensated, no more facing mass starvation. Starting maximum wages, cause these bosses pay these wages. Like a path of enslaved can make the payments.
Mansions and cars as plantations. No more prisons, only visions of places giving real rehabilitation. Anyone who needs help in any given situation. Say no prohibition, cause we pro-legalization. Pro the basics. Pro-mandatory classes and pro-human relations. Pro-mutual aid trade and pro-living with no borders and one pro-worker nation. Pro-having dreams awaken. Pro-seeing every person with clean water sanitation. You pro that or pro-hatred, battles raging. Battle rights against self-gratification. If you want to understand that line, understand that your school gave you no real education. Cause nothing's nothing's more important than improving human relations, guaranteeing human rights is in place with no more rich and poor situations. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We ain't never gonna stop, cause we always gonna call for
Medicare for all, that means the money for medication. The more letting people die who can't afford a medical evaluation. The more having your home taken as you saving to make medical payments. It's basic. No more only treating those hurt who can afford a situation. No more poor people fighting against privatization. Means not only the rich but all get a college education. No more keeping people packed in ignorant ways we raised
no
them.
more form for politicians, blame the victim justification. No more first and third world nation relation exploitation. No more ignoring the poor's mental activation. No more unjust war taxation. Human needs on top, all else it falls on the bottom of the equation. I rap my revelations and raps rap with declarations. We want all torture ended with no hesitation. We want one love. Bob Marley writes vibrations. We want a world without bosses. Every worker has the same. With these basics we say we want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We ain't never gonna stop, cause we always gonna call.
No more acting like we living in a world of individuals. Living in this way has its limits, very minimum.
Like a young sister or brother, we all depend on each other. Truth, the human rights lover, truth uncover the tree hugger. But man, the facts always facts. Always the best thing you can have in this world is compassion. Don't just talk, take action.
It's not all about you, it's all about you and me. There's a you need to see in the concept of community.
You got a kid with flat tires. They take their car into a mechanic that you hired. Here you see what trust is diet. Cause of life's dependent on the shop's type of they can give it tires, it's not safe, it's a disgrace. Thinking life's about first and second place. When we all need to win in the game of life we place. Then we blame competition to embrace cooperation. Imagine everyone not rich joined in unification, working for a mutual elevation, which will be the best result of any human communication. Till the end, we're gonna call again like this for liberation. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We ain't never gonna stop, cause we always gonna call. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We want jobs, food, and homes for all. We ain't never gonna stop, cause we always gonna call more. We just want our rights. We just want our rights. Cause there's nothing more important in the world than human rights. Cause there's nothing more important in the world than human rights. We just want our rights. Cause there's nothing just want our rights. We just want our rights. Cause there's nothing just want our rights. This group's working to make it happen. Working for human rights. You can find something listed at thetruthmusic.com. Come on. That's THA True.